Imagine giving up your friends, your family, your health, and sacrificing every part of your life for a chance to achieve your greatest dream. You spend years dreaming of making it to Formula One, and after so many sacrifices, when you finally achieve it, suddenly everything comes to an end. Because in Formula One, not all dreams come true. Promising drivers who died before they even got started, legends who gave their lives on the track, and champions who never got to lift their trophy. The worst part is that many didn't die because of their own mistakes. They died because of poorly designed cars, unsafe tracks, and incomprehensible decisions. They died because of a racing series that often failed to protect them. Today, you're going to relive the most heartbreaking tragedies that forever marked Formula One, so absurd and so avoidable that today they still hurt, as if they happened yesterday. Some you probably know. Others are about drivers whose names you've never heard but who deserve to be remembered. Because this is also a way to honor them, to not forget them, to tell what they lived through and what they shouldn't have had to experience. And they all have something in common. Their stories ended too soon, and they should never have ended that way. So stay until the end to commemorate each one of them. Jules Bianchi was more than just a promise. He was the future of Ferrari. He was 25 years old and had a career that was just starting to take off. But at the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, that future was shattered forever. The rain wouldn't stop. The track was getting more and more slippery, and on lap 42, Adrian Sutil lost control of his car and crashed into the barriers. Because of this, a crane came in to remove his Sauber without the safety car being deployed. Even though the conditions were extremely dangerous, the track was soaked, visibility was low, and there was heavy machinery in the middle of the circuit. Incredibly, only yellow flags were shown.
Una decisión totalmente irresponsable.
And one lap later, in the same spot, Bianchi lost control. He slid on the wet asphalt and crashed into the crane at 126 kilometers per hour. It was a hard impact. No explosion, but brutal. Bianchi was left unconscious. He suffered severe head injuries and was rushed to the hospital, where he was placed in an induced coma. He remained like that for 9 months. 9 months of waiting. 9 months without answers. Until finally, on July 17, 2015, his family confirmed his passing. It was the first death in Formula One in more than 2 decades. And it wasn't caused by speed, nor by driver error, but by negligence that could easily have been avoided. A chain of bad decisions that ended the life of a young driver. The death of Jules Bianchi was one of the most heartbreaking losses in the history of Formula One, and it should never have happened. Unfortunately, this was not the only time a driver died due to the irresponsibility of the organization. And believe me, it only gets worse each time. But before we continue, subscribe. Lorenzo Bandini was one of the crowd favorites. His closeness to Ferrari and his daring style had made him a beloved figure in Formula One. But at the 1967 Monaco Grand Prix, his story ended in the most devastating way possible. Bandini was battling for the win on the streets of Monte Carlo when he lost control at the harbor chicane, and this happened. The Ferrari crashed into the safety barriers, flipped over, and immediately caught fire. The car ended up upside down, and Bandini was trapped among the wreckage as the flames engulfed him. All of this happened before the horrified eyes of the public, with cameras broadcasting it live to the entire world. Even so, he managed to be rescued alive, but he had burns on more than 70% of his body. And that's when the real tragedy began. For 3 days, Bandini fought to survive. 3 days of extreme pain, medical interventions, constant suffering, and a tense wait that paralyzed all of Italy. Finally, after those 3 days of unbearable agony, Bandini passed away at the age of 31, and a race in which he was fighting for victory ended up being his last. This was one of the most painful deaths Formula One has ever experienced, not only because of how it happened, but because of everything he suffered. He went through it. Roger Williamson was one of the young prospects in Formula One and was only competing in his second race in the championship. And it was at that 1973 Dutch Grand Prix where everything ended in the most tragic way possible. During the race at Sandburg, he suffered a mechanical failure at high speed, and this happened. One of the tires burst. The car hit the wall and slid for 275 meters until it ended up upside down against the barriers. Additionally, the car caught fire while it was still sliding on the track. Williamson was not unconscious, nor had he been seriously injured. He was alive and could be heard screaming desperately for help.
Thank you. Emergency services arrived in 8 minutes. An eternity.
But nobody did anything. At first, the commentators, race control, and even some drivers assumed that the accident had happened to another racer and that he had already come out unscathed. So everything continued as normal. And while the race went on, Roger Williamson was suffocating from the smoke. The only one who stopped was his friend David Purley. He jumped out of the car in desperation, ran toward the fire, and tried to help. He himself used the extinguisher to try to put out the flames, without a fireproof suit, without equipment, without help, and without time. In fact, one of the marshals even tried to move Purley away from the scene as if everything was under control, but obviously it wasn't. Not a single one came closer to help while they listened to Williamson's desperate screams. Meanwhile, some spectators tried to jump the fences to intervene, but they were stopped by the staff. And as if that wasn't enough, the fire truck took 8 minutes to arrive. But by the time it showed up, it was already too late. Williamson didn't die because of the accident. He died of smoke inhalation, trapped, alone, and begging for help. A slow death while the whole world watched. At just 25 years old, he suffered one of the most unfair tragedies this sport has ever seen. And the worst part is that Roger Williamson could have survived, but he was the victim of a chain of mistakes. Unforgivable errors. Joachim Rindt was about to be crowned world champion and was the man dominating the 1970s season with unstoppable aggression. He had won 5 of the first 8 races and no driver was close to catching him. Everything indicated that he was about to achieve glory, but in Monza, his fate changed forever. During a practice session for the Italian Grand Prix, his car suffered a mechanical failure at over 250 km/h. He lost stability, and this happened. The car veered out of control and crashed head-on into a metal barrier. One of the anchors broke, the front part of the Lotus got stuck underneath, and the impact completely destroyed the front of the car. Rindt was wearing his safety harness without the crotch strap. This was a common practice to escape faster in case of fire, and it caused him to slide under the belt. The crash was brutal, and he died before reaching the hospital. He was only 28 years old. The most tragic thing is that just a few days earlier, he had seriously considered retiring. The deaths of his friends Bruce McLaren and Pierce Courage had deeply affected him, and he was no longer thinking only about himself. He was thinking about his daughter. He wanted to be there for her, but unfortunately, he didn't get to make that decision. The season went on, but no one managed to surpass him in points. And so Joachim Rindt became the first and, to this day, only world champion. Crowned posthumously, a title without a podium, without celebration, and a champion who never got to see his own crowning. But that wasn't the worst part, because later investigations confirmed that it wasn't just a mechanical failure, but a poorly installed safety barrier that sealed his fate. So, like several of the cases we've seen throughout this video, his death could have been easily avoided. But unfortunately, this wasn't the last one. And now, if you're finding this video interesting, subscribe. Josh Leeser had spent his whole life fighting for this moment. And after competing for 2 decades in all kinds of categories and making all kinds of sacrifices, he finally got what he wanted most at age 40, making his Formula One debut in a works car. But what was supposed to be the beginning of a dream ended in a terrible tragedy. At the 1968 French Grand Prix, Honda decided to put him behind the wheel of the RA302, an experimental prototype built with an extremely flammable magnesium chassis, a car that was not ready to compete. A car that John Surtees, world champion in 1964 and Leeser's teammate, had described as a death trap. And just on the second lap of his first race, Leeser lost control on a fast corner. The car hit an embankment, flipped over, and instantly caught fire. The magnesium burned so violently that the fire was impossible to contain. Leeser was trapped in the flames, had no chance to escape, and died before anyone could help him. Incredibly, the race was not stopped. The remains of the car stayed on the asphalt while everything continued as if nothing had happened. Finally, John Surtees got on the podium without knowing that the man who had died was his own teammate. What Honda did was so despicable. Shortly after, Surtees left the team, and the scandal was so big that the Japanese brand also left the category. That's how the dream ended for a man who sacrificed everything to reach Formula One and who lost his life because of his own team's irresponsibility by putting him in a car that should never have touched the track. Gilles Villeneuve was much more than a driver for Ferrari. He was the chosen one to become one of the greatest legends in the team's history. But at the 1982 Belgian Grand Prix, that very special bond was broken forever. During qualifying, Villeneuve had only one goal: to beat his teammate, Didier Pironi. He hated him. But on that last flying lap attempt, at full speed, he came across Jochen Mass's car in a fast corner, moving much more slowly. And then this happened. The Ferrari lifted off and was launched at over 200 km/h. It crashed several times against the ground, and after the last impact, Gilles, still strapped to his seat, was catapulted another 50 meters until he slammed into the barriers. The marshals found him among the wreckage without his helmet and with fatal injuries to his neck. He was taken to the hospital immediately while his wife traveled to be with him. But unfortunately, there was nothing more that could be done. Villeneuve was driven by the belief that he had to win at any cost. But it was that conviction that cost him his life. That is how one of the greatest talents Formula One has ever seen passed away. A tragedy that will be remembered forever. The 1960 Belgian Grand Prix was one of the darkest weekends in the history of Formula One. In a matter of minutes, two young drivers lost their lives in a brutal and unexpected way at the Spa-Francorchamps circuit. First, Chris Bristol. At just 22 years old, he lost control of his Cooper in one of the fastest sections of the track, and this happened. He crashed into an embankment, was thrown from his car, and in a scene as horrible as it was shocking, he was decapitated when he landed on a barbed wire fence. But unfortunately, that wasn't all. 5 laps later, the second tragedy occurred. Alan Stacey also lost control of his car. It's believed he was hit in the face by a bird while driving at over 200 km/h. The car shot off the track, flipped over, and instantly caught fire. Stacey was trapped inside the car and burned to death without anyone being able to help him. He was only 26 years old. 2 deaths in the same race. 2 young lives lost in minutes. And a brutal demonstration of how fragile Formula One was in those years. This was the first time that 2 drivers died during the same Grand Prix, but unfortunately it was not the last. Tom Pryce was one of Formula One's brightest prospects. With his natural talent and aggressive style, many saw him as a future champion. But at the 1977 South African Grand Prix tragedy struck him in the most absurd and chilling way. On lap 22, Renzo Sorsi's car stopped at the side of the main straight and caught fire, but the driver managed to get out on his own. Despite the smoke and having a car stopped at the side of the track, no yellow flag was shown, and the race continued as if nothing had happened. At that moment, 2 very young marshals, without authorization or training, decided to cross the track to try to put out the fire. They were carrying 18-kilogram fire extinguishers with them, but the second one was hit head-on by Tom Pryce's car. The impact was brutal. The marshal's body was thrown into the air. He landed several meters ahead and died instantly at just 19 years old. And as if that wasn't enough, the fire extinguisher he was carrying hit Pryce directly on the head, also killing him instantly. With Pryce already lifeless, but with his foot still on the accelerator, his car continued out of control for more than 700 meters. The car went off track, crashed into an emergency entrance, and ended up hitting Jacques Lafitte's car. Both of them ended up crashing into a concrete wall. Lafitte, who was unharmed, approached Price's car, but he was horrified when he saw the condition his colleague was in. A chilling, unnecessary, and completely avoidable scene. Worst of all, the race continued despite the tragedy that had just occurred. Tom Price was only 27 years old when he lost his life due to a chain of errors, negligence, and poor organization by Formula One.
Nunca debió haber permitido.
This is how the two most absurd and saddest deaths in this sport happened. Wolfgang von Trips was one step away from being crowned world champion. In 1961, he was leading the championship with Ferrari. He was 4 points ahead of his teammate Phil Hill. And everything indicated that that day he was going to fulfill his lifelong dream. But instead of a title, fate handed him a tragedy. One of the most chilling ever experienced in Formula One. The previous year, drivers and constructors had boycotted the race at Monza because they considered the circuit extremely dangerous, and it was agreed that 1960 would be the last time the race would be held on that track. Although in the end, the change was postponed for a year. A decision that would go down in history as one of the biggest mistakes Formula One ever made. On the second lap of the race, Von Trips was fighting for position with Jim Clark. Their cars touched on the straight, and this happened. The Ferrari veered off toward an unprotected area, lifted off, and ended up going through a place crowded with spectators. Von Trips was thrown from the car and the single-seater plowed through the crowd. The driver died before reaching the hospital at just 33 years old. And along with him, 15 spectators also died, who had only come to enjoy the sport they loved so much. But the most disturbing thing of all is that the race continued as if nothing had happened. The organizers claimed that suspending it would have made it harder for the ambulances to do their job. And while the tragedy was unfolding in the stands, on the track, everything went on as if nothing had happened. In the end, Phil Hill won the race, and with it, the world championship by just 1 point. But he only found out what had happened after getting off the podium. Von Trips was supposed to be champion in 1961. But his story didn't end with a coronation, but with his death and that of 15 innocent people who had only gone to watch a race, a tragedy as painful as it was unfair, and one of the darkest that Formula One has ever experienced. But before we get to the greatest tragedy in the history of the sport, if you've made it this far and you're finding the video interesting, subscribe. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix is, to this day, the most tragic weekend in the history of Formula One. During that season, the atmosphere was tense. The drivers were increasingly questioning the safety of the cars, and many felt that it was only a matter of time before a catastrophe happened. And unfortunately, they were right. It all started on Friday during free practice. Rubens Barrichello, a young prospect, lost control of his car, and the following happened. He was unconscious with a broken nose and a dislocated arm. The marshals saved his life thanks to their quick reaction. But this was just the beginning and a warning that the worst was yet to come. On Saturday, during qualifying, Roland Ratzenberger lost his front wing after damaging his car on the previous lap. And without downforce, he couldn't stop his Simtech. He crashed at over 300 km/h and died instantly from a skull fracture in just his third Formula One race at the age of 33. The images were brutal as television showed Ratzenberger dead with a broken neck. After this tragedy, the logical thing would have been to cancel the Grand Prix. In fact, under Italian law, the race had to be canceled if a driver died during the weekend. But that didn't happen, because aside from the negligence when it came to safety, Formula One had economic interests that were too big to stop racing. The show had to go on. But what happened the next day ended up making the weekend the most tragic in the history of this sport. Someone who was deeply affected by Ratzenberger's death was Ayrton Senna. He seriously considered withdrawing from the race. But in the end, he decided to race, not for the points nor for the glory, but with the intention of dedicating the victory to his late colleague. And so we come to Sunday. Senna started from pole position. He was the idol of millions. a three-time world champion, and still had a great career ahead of him. But while he was leading on the 6th lap, this happened. His Williams went off the track at Tamburello at over 300 km/h. He crashed into the wall and a piece of the front suspension pierced his helmet. And although he was airlifted to the hospital, he was declared dead hours later. He was 34 years old, and an accident that didn't seem so serious at first ended up being fatal. Formula One was left shattered. Brazil went into national mourning, and the whole world watched one of the greatest of all time die in a race that should never have been run. Because if the drivers' complaints about safety had been listened to, Ratzenberger and Senna would still be alive. Or if the FIA had respected its own rules, Senna would never have gone out on track that Sunday. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix was not just a dark weekend. It was a chain of mistakes and decisions driven by economic interests that led to a tragedy which changed the history of Formula One. And what I told you is just the beginning. If you want to know the full list of the 15 most tragic deaths in the history of Formula One, watch this video. You will find the tribute to the rest of the drivers who lost their lives before their time. Also, I'll leave the link in the description.